Good morning, and it's always good to be with you. I hope that you're being patient with me as we get through the Gideon narrative. It is a long study, I know. As we said a few weeks ago, we're looking at seven different lessons just dedicated to Gideon in our study of the book of Judges, chapters 1 through 8. As you saw on the screen just for a brief second, we're in lesson 10 overall, and the title of this week's lesson is "The Sovereignty of God Gives Us Courage." And what we're talking about there, of course, is the fact that we're going to see that God is in control of all circumstances that are taking place here. Gideon is going to see that, and that's going to literally give him courage to act. And along the way, we'll see some application for us. And we have a couple of words of application and just reflection near the end. We still have two more lessons through the study of the book of, or through the life of Gideon. And I want to draw some of those applications together as we go forward as well. As we get started, just a reminder, we're looking at chapter 7, verses 12 through 22 today. But I think it's going to be important to go back and look at verses 9 to 11. I'll read those in a moment so that we can get the context there, because really last week's lesson left us with a bit of a cliffhanger. We're told Gideon is to do something, and he gets ready to do it. Now we're going to see the results of him doing that. So let's go ahead and let me read that first, then I'll bring up our screen showing what the cycle looks like again, where we are fitting into all of that. And as we move forward, then we'll pull up a couple of other things just to get ready for our lesson. But let me go ahead and read chapter 7, verses 9 through 11 real quickly. Remember that God has called Gideon and is preparing him. He's dealing with Gideon's fears along the way. And just when Gideon has come around to recognize that God is going to be with him, they're set up for battle. And in verse 9, God tells Gideon to do something if he's afraid, just to be encouraged. And so here's what he says, verses 9 through 11. That night, the Lord said to him, "Get up and attack the camp, for I have handed it over to you. But if you are afraid to attack the camp, then go down with Purah, your servant. Listen to what they say, and then you will be encouraged to attack the camp." So he went down with Purah, his servant, to the outpost of the troops who were in the camp. We'll continue to read the rest of that section in a moment, but just remember that what we have here is Gideon going down to get some encouragement. So his going, as we said last week, indicated, one, that he was afraid, but two, that he also trusted God was going to give him a word through the Midianites about God giving the Midianites into the hands of Gideon and into the hands of the Israelite army. Remember, we're talking about Gideon and 300 others. So remember where we are when we study the book of Judges, that we are looking specifically at a cycle of the people going through, and what they're doing is they are sinning, and then they go through oppression as a result of their sin. They cry out to God for help. And where we've been for the last several weeks is in that deliverance section of the cycle, chapter 6, verse 7, all the way through 8, verse 35. As we look at that, we're going to be in that for this lesson and next week's lesson. And then we'll have a follow-up lesson regarding what happens to the people of Israel after Gideon dies. Along the way, though, I want to go ahead and give a quick overview of the outline, what we're going to be looking at today. Lesson 10, of course, the sovereignty of God gives us courage. First, we're going to look at verses 12 through 14, and we're going to see that Gideon does receive instant reassurance. It's going to be very important. He goes down because he is afraid, but he also knows God's going to give him a word. He will receive that word. Then we're going to see in verses 15 through 18, Gideon gives instructions for battle. And we'll look and see what those instructions are. As we get ready to start, we'll see they're rather unusual. That doesn't seem to be out of God's character sometimes, as we'll note. And then lastly, we're going to see Gideon leads the initial stage of the battle, verses 19 through 22. And that's going to be very important to recognize, is that it is the initial stages. We're going to see the battle begin in this lesson, but it's going to continue into next lesson as well. As we get ready to think about the text, though, it's not unusual for God to give a word of encouragement, a word of promise, and a word of his own presence with the people as they go into a difficult situation, and many times a situation that involves a battle. a couple of unusual ones that have occurred prior to this one, you'll remember, is the story of Moses and the Israelites in Exodus. They're not long out of their exodus from Egypt when they're in the Sinai Peninsula moving north, and they encounter the Amalekites, the ancestors, if you will, of some of the Amalekites that are joining with the Midianites here. But one of the things that was unusual about the battle is God was giving the Amalekites over to the Israelites as they fought. But what was unusual about it is Moses indicated that he will hold up his arms. He will stand on a hill looking out over the valley where the battle would occur. Joshua would lead in the battle. And what would happen then is Moses, as long as his arms were up, the Israelites were winning. But as his arms started to come down, the Amalekites started winning. So at some point during the battle, what happened was both Aaron, Moses' brother, and Hur, one of the other assistants with him, brought big rocks for Moses to put his arms on. He was able to sit down. And then eventually Aaron and Hur both held up the arms of Moses so that eventually the Israelites do defeat the Amalekites. The next one also involves Joshua, and this is a very familiar story to you in Joshua chapter 6. Remember the story of beating the Amalekites in Exodus was Exodus 17. When we look here at the book of Joshua chapter 6, of course, the famous story is the defeat of Jericho. We won't go through the entire details there, but just remember the unusual circumstance there where God told the Israelites to walk around the city, and they did that for a series of 6 days. And then on the seventh day, they walked around 7 times. And then after walking around 7 times, what they did is then they blew their trumpets. And what happened? The walls fell down, making it possible for the Israelites to go straight into the town and defeat the people of Jericho. Here, we have an unusual circumstance as well. As you'll see in a moment, the instructions that are going to be given for the initial stage of the battle will have some similarities to what we saw with Joshua, but then obviously some very distinct ideas or distinct activities. So it kind of goes back to what we would say, you've heard people say before, the Lord moves in mysterious ways. It's very clear here that he often asks his people to move in mysterious ways, unusual ways. And of course, the whole point here is that it's going to teach the Israelites that he is the one who is bringing the victory. And that's going to be important because remember last lesson, we saw that God had reduced the army from 32,000 all the way to 300 plus Gideon. And the reason for that was God didn't want to give Israel any reason to believe that they were the reason for the victory. That's going to be an important concept we're going to bring in today's lesson as well. So we do see something unusual there. You could probably think of some other unusual activity in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, the way God would work among his people. So we saw God giving Gideon all the instruction he needed, all the encouragement he needed. We saw last week when the army was reduced that Gideon doesn't speak. He doesn't object. He just obeys. He does what God tells him to do. And as we read here just a moment ago, what we find is that God gives Gideon one more opportunity to deal with his fear, and that is to go down into the camp to hear what it is that they are saying about the what they're saying about what's about to happen that will give Gideon some encouragement. So what we're going to see is what happens when Gideon does obey and follows God's instruction. So we've already gone through the cycle. We've looked at the outline. Let me go ahead and read the first section. We'll walk through it quickly and then, or in detail. I won't say quickly. I'm never going to promise quickly. But we'll look at that, cover some things that need to be said, and we'll pull it all together. So chapter 7, verses 12 to 14, carrying over what we just read from verses 9 through 11, Gideon receives instant reassurance. So he goes down to the Midianite camp with his servant Purah. And here's what happens. Chapter 7, verse 12 reads, "Now the Midianites, Amalekites, and all the people of the east had settled down in the valley like a swarm of locusts, and their camels were as innumerable as the sand on the seashore. When Gideon arrived, there was a man telling his friend about a dream. He said, 'Listen, I had a dream. A loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp, struck a tent, and it fell. The loaf turned the tent upside down so that it collapsed.'" verse 14, his friend answered, "This is nothing less than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash, the Israelite. God has handed the entire Midianite camp over to him." A rather interesting series of events taking place here. Well, first of all, let's deal with verse 12 and the description of the size of the coalition. We said last week that until we started to see the reduction of the Israelite army, we didn't know how many people had showed up to support Gideon. We know then that it was 32,000 reduced to 10,000, reduced to 300. At this point in the narrative, as we said last week, and now today, we still don't know how many are in the Midianite camp. We learn in chapter 8 how many ultimately were there. But all we see here in the description in verse 12 is that they were settled like a swarm of locusts. And that repeats the phrase that was used back in chapter 6, verse 5. Also, the idea of locusts would conjure up various memories, like from the plagues in Egypt, but also there are other places throughout the Old Testament that refer to locusts in a way of describing a large group, whether it be how large a group of people was or what kind of destruction came upon the people. It would be likened unto a locust infestation. Then we also have that unusual comment about the camels. We mentioned camels a couple of lessons ago. They were probably not used for war. I don't think that they would be battle, but they would have some form of use. But we're told there that they were innumerable as the sand on the seashore. And that's a common phrase to describe a large number as well. And I won't go through all the details. I won't give you all the verse references, but I do want to point out the times when we do see the idea of a number being so large that it's compared to the number of sands on the seashore. One, probably the most famous, is in Genesis chapter 22, verse 17, where God promised Abraham that his descendants will be numbering beyond the number of stars and to the sands on the seashore. So great promise there. That is extended later when Jacob, wrestling with God, then reminds God of his promise that there would be that large number, descendants, as the number of the sea or the sand in the seashore. Jeremiah 32:22 describes David's descendants in those terms. Later on in Hosea, we see that after they go through their punishment in exile, there will be a return and there will be a numbering in comparison to the number of the sands on the seashore. We see in a couple of other places that Joseph's work in the book of Genesis, when he goes down to Egypt and serves there, is able to provide or store up provisions that would equal the number of the sands on the seashore. We see in Psalm 78, for instance, a remembrance of God's provision for the people while they were in exile or while they were in the wilderness wandering, that their provision of meat and birds was like the sand on the seashore. There are also a couple of places where there is a reference to the enemy being as large as a swarm of locusts, or excuse me, not the swarm of locusts, but as the sand on the seashore. And that is Joshua 11:4, the northern Canaanite tribes, when Joshua led the northern campaign of the Israelites into the land of promise. They are described as being like the sand on the seashore. Of course, our passage today, then in 1 Samuel 3:15, a reference to the Philistines fighting against Saul and Israel. And then interestingly enough, you have in Revelation a reference to Gog and Magog after the time period of Satan being locked up. There will be a great war, and Gog and Magog come up against God's people, and they are like sand on the seashore. A couple of others real quickly, a reference to Absalom gathering a number of people against his father David. We have places where promises of a number being equal to the sand on the seashore, or at least comparable to it, would be places where in 1 Kings a couple of times there's a reference to the people being or God fulfilling his promise of the number of people equaling the sand on the seashore. We could go on and on. I don't want to belabor that point. We see also a reference to the promise made to Abraham, repeated in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 18, about God giving Abraham a promise of many descendants. We see in Psalm 139:18, for instance, David saying that God's thoughts are so innumerable, they're like the sand on the seashore. Sadly, in Jeremiah 15:8, when warning against the disobedient Jews or the people from Judah, God tells them that the number of their widows will equal the number of sands on the seashore. And Job in a couple of places describes his life as being miserable and all the things that he described. Just the atrocities he dealt with could not be numbered, like the sand on the seashore. What I want you to see here is not just a common theme here, but again, get in your mind that if you are an Israelite reading this text, you recognize these motifs, what swarm of locusts mean and what sand on the seashore means. For our purposes right now, though, think about this. God had promised that the Israelites would number like the sand on the seashore, and yet now their enemy in their land was described in that way. And you can see what the nature of the threat was there. They already dealt with 7 years of this coming and going of the Midianites coming in and basically taking their crops, pillaging their land, and making them run scared and hide away. And now they're about ready to face battle. And they see in front of them what they call not only a swarm of locusts, but even the camels are numbered in such a way as to be compared to the sand on the seashore. Well, we're told they go down there. And what we see then is Gideon goes down with Purah. That's his servant. Now, the question is, what role did Purah play? Was he a soldier, fellow soldier? Many suggest that he might have been one of the servants that helped him tear down the altar of Baal, and that might be a possibility. Now, there are many reasons perhaps it wouldn't be an actual soldier, maybe going down if there was a bad word that he didn't want to relay that back to the camp. But it could also be going back to corroborate the good news that that Gideon would receive. It's not the first time that spying out the enemy would occur. You know very well that Moses sent 12 spies into the promised land long ago. We see Joshua then sent spies into Jericho prior to taking Jericho. Interestingly enough, in those instances, neither of the leaders went, but in this instance, the leader does go. Gideon is the spy along with his servant, and he goes in. And of course, he goes because as the leader, he's the one that has to face his fear. And as he fears, then the rest of the people may fear. And as a result, he needs to have his fear resolved. And so what we find here is Gideon goes down into the area and he goes into the camp. We looked at maps last week. I'll show you a map again this week, just as we see the Midianites start to flee. But I want you to note that it was a very large area. I showed you that they would have been encamped on the bottom or in the valley below Mount Moreh, north of the camp of where the Israelites were. But being so large, they could have spread out not to just below the south part of Mount Moreh, but even to the western part. Just imagine you're sitting here as Gideon with 300 soldiers, and you're overlooking a valley that contains 135,000 Midianites. Now, again, in our reading of the text right now, we don't know that that's how many there were. We just know that it's a huge number. So Gideon goes with Purah. What's interesting, of course, is as he goes into the camp, he walks right into an area where he can hear a man talking with a friend about a dream that he'd just had. And I think this is one of those examples of God's sovereignty. God knew Gideon was going, and he then spoke to a Midianite in a dream. He also gave the interpretation of that dream to his friend. We'll talk about that in a moment. But notice here some other elements. God's sovereignty could be described in a couple of other ways. Gideon hears the word, but that means he went to the right place at the right time. Now, consider how big this camp was. Remember, we saw some pictures of that. Hopefully you watched the videos that I had linked for you to watch. Those would have been even more visible and a better visual aid for you. But imagine going in and 135,000. Again, we don't know the number here. Act like we don't know the number yet. But such a large group. Gideon just walks. He and Purah go at night, and then they encounter hearing one man in his tent talking to another man about this dream that he's had. So part of the sovereignty of God then could be either described in God in some way leading Gideon without his knowledge where he was going, or it could be this: God knows where Gideon is going, and knowing that while it's evening and they're sleeping, God gives a dream to someone in a tent near where he knows Gideon is going to be walking. And not just the dream, as we said, but also an interpretation of the dream. Now, I believe in the sovereignty of God. I believe that God is in control. I believe that nothing happens without his knowledge. And I do think that there are times when he directly will cause things. And in this instance, what he causes and what he's knowledgeable of may be a little bit of a mixture of things. But here I do think that this is evidence that God is watching over and governing what's taking place, all for the purpose in this moment of giving Gideon the word of encouragement and strength that he needs. But notice how these events just coalesce. From our reading, how is Gideon going to know where to go? He just goes. But I think that shows a little bit of the development of his faith, and that he just walks. He never questions where he's supposed to go. He doesn't say, God, where do I know? How will I know where I'm going? He's told that when he goes, he will hear what they are saying. So, like I said, the text doesn't tell us everything. We do know that Gideon ends up in the right place at the right time. And given the circumstances of the large nature of the troops, it's rather amazing. I will say it that way. Did Gideon know exactly what he was going to hear? I don't know that he knew what he was going to hear, but it's one of those situations where he knew it when he heard it. He would know it when he heard it. God didn't say, you're going to hear so-and-so say thus and such. He just said, you're going to hear what they say, and that will give you encouragement. And what is it that he heard? He heard a man sharing his dream with another man. And they had heard what was going on. So we're going to see here what takes place after this. And moving forward in the text, it's rather interesting the way God makes this dream available to the Midianite and the way he relays the dream. He doesn't tell the man, Gideon is coming and he's going to be defeating you. He gives it to him in an image. And remember the nature of this image. It's rather interesting if you think about it. A round loaf of barley bread. Some translations are going to say a round loaf of bread or round barley bread. The point is that it's a loaf of bread. It's a small barley bread. And the dream says, the man says that in his dream that the barley rolled, it tumbled into the camp. It's like I'm imaging this in my mind as I go through it. And I'm thinking of this barley bread rolling down the hill from Mount Gilboa across the valley and into the camp. Now, I also want you to think about a typical size barley bread or barley loaf. It would not be very big at all. Okay, something about in your hand. Notice also that it comes down, we're told, with such force that we're given basically two types of descriptions, or we're given a description of what happens twice for emphasis. It came into the camp with such force that when it hit the tent, it knocked the tent over and it fell. Then we're told it turned it over and the tent collapsed. So think about that. Think of the average size barley bread and think of the average size tent. Now, many of you camp. I'm not a big camper, but I have camped enough to know there are different sizes of tents. I don't know how many people would have been in a Midianite tent. But we don't need to know that in order to recognize that you have a tent that will hold at least two people and a piece of barley bread. And that's going to knock down a tent. Now, I have to admit, in my early years of reading this text, and I'd hear this dream relayed, I would think that the barley bread was like some huge, maybe even Volkswagen or chariot size bread coming down and knocking down the tent. That's the only way I could think of a barley bread knocking down a tent. But as I've read the text more and more, there's nothing to say that there was anything unusual about the size of this barley bread. So keep in mind, this is just a typical size barley bread and a typical size tent. Now, what happens? This little barley bread knocks down this tent. And immediately upon hearing it, the friend says in response, this is nothing less than the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, the Israelite. Well, first we know that he recognized that this is Gideon by name, by clan, and by nationality. He is an Israelite. They might have heard about Gideon. I mean, the Midianites and the Amalekites and the people of the east obviously are there ready to do battle with the Israelites. And there's no doubt that over a period of time, as this has been occurring, word is getting out that it's going to be Gideon that's leading the battle. Gideon now has gone from a rather really obscure figure to someone who is about to lead an army, minimal as it is, to fight against the Midianites. It could be that this particular soldier didn't know exactly the name, but God had given him the name. But it's interesting. The idea is that they know that, or at least this man does in relaying the interpretation of the dream, that this means Gideon, the son of Joash the Israelite, is going to defeat them. And then beyond that, he goes on to say, God has handed the entire Midianite camp over to him. That's important to note, because on a couple of other occasions already, God has told Gideon that very same thing. And now he's hearing this from the lips of a Midianite, one of the enemy. We'll see what Gideon does here in a moment. But it's interesting to kind of wrestle with the idea of the barley loaf and the tent. Why is that significant? Well, it could mean simply that the small barley loaf is going to be able to take down a big tent. In other words, something very small will defeat something very big. It could mean that. It could be something related to the fact that Israelites were considered like barley loaves to the Midianites. Some texts suggest that the Midianites would use the name barley because it was kind of the poor man's bread. Sometimes they would feed it to the animals. And as a result, this was the Midianite view of the Israelite. They thought of them as just nothing. And of course, they had been plundering their land for 7 years. And so it's very clear Midianites have a very, very low view of Israel, just like this form of bread would have been one of the lower forms of bread. That's possible. If anything, you could say that barley was representative of farmers. And we know that Gideon was, the people of the land were farming and having their farms plundered. And that the tent would be representative of nomadic people. And the Midianites and the Amalekites often were such. And so there could be some symbolism there as well. And so, if anything, it's speaking in a language of metaphors that the Midianite would understand and make the interpretation. It could be any number of those. It could be all of those. You could even stop and say it's just a little thing defeating a big thing, and that gets at it. But there may be some underlying currents there as well. One of the things, one of the things we want to just reiterate is that what Gideon hears from this Midianite are the exact same words he's already heard from God on a couple of occasions. Remember in chapter 6, verse 16, God tells him he will be with him to defeat the Midianites. Chapter 36, or chapter 6, verse 36, when Gideon tests God, he's saying, I want to know for sure that you're going to do as you said, which is that he would defeat the Midianites. And then, of course, in chapter 7, verse 9, he says, I am going to lead you into to defeat the Midianites. But if you're afraid, then go down to the camp. And that's where he is right now. So what happens? He hears this. He knows that victory is going to go to Gideon and to God. The question is, well, let me get to the sovereignty part again. I just want to reiterate that the sovereignty issue, in fact, God is in control and in ruling over the situation. He's got everything under control, is a way of saying it as well. Leading to Gideon the right place, and Gideon hearing the message as he needed, just as God was leading the man to have a dream and his friend to know the interpretation. Just bear that in mind. We can see God is in control. So God has made the promise that he would watch over Gideon. Now he is showing Gideon through other means, which is interesting because when you think about it, we've already said God has told him. He's heard it on a number of other occasions through this time, the time that we've been looking at the text, and he's heard it in different ways. And he's heard it through direct word. He's heard it. He's seen it through signs, and now he's hearing it through the relaying of a dream. These are various ways that God has made his will known and his revelation known to people over time. So Gideon's kind of getting the full gamut of ways God has revealed himself. Before we move on, though, we see Gideon's response. So I want to give you a little bit of a narrative or a literary thing to keep in mind before we move forward. We were told that Gideon would be victorious, but God would get the victory. That God is going to be the one to defeat the Midianites on behalf of the Israelites. And we see that taking place here. But now, Gideon may be picking up on something that the Midianites said, that he will then relay to his army when he gets back to camp. Notice that first the Midianites said that it is the sword of Gideon. This little piece of bread represented the sword of Gideon. Gideon may be picking up on that theme as he goes back and talks to his people in a moment. We'll see that. We'll leave it as a speculation, but there's more to the story as we go through the Gideon narrative this week and in the coming weeks. So pay very close attention to that reference that this was the sword of Gideon, son of Joash, the Israelite. Something will happen here in the text, and we'll see something take place that may indicate Gideon has got faith in God, but he may be a little bit too confident in himself as well as we look later in the text. So bear that in mind. He is encouraged now, and that's evident. When he hears this, we see in verses 15 to 18, he now goes back and gives instructions for battle. In dividing the text, I really probably could have kept the first part of verse 15 with the text we just read, but I think we'll move on and keep it here. But I do want you to see what takes place before Gideon goes back. So let's read verses 15 to 18. Gideon gives instructions for battle. Verse 15 reads, "When Gideon heard the account of the dream and its interpretation, he bowed in worship. He returned to Israel's camp and said, 'Get up, for the Lord has handed the Midianite camp over to you.'" Verse 16, "Then he divided the 300 men into three companies and gave each of the men a ram's horn in one hand and an empty pitcher with a torch inside it in the other hand." Verse 17 through 18, then with instructions here, he says, "Watch me," he said to them, "and do what I do. When I come to the outpost of the camp, do as I do. When I and everyone with me blow our ram's horns, you are also to blow your ram's horns all around the camp. Then you will say, 'For the Lord and for Gideon.'" Well, let's go through the text. First part of verse 15. Gideon bowed in worship. I want you to stop and think about that for a moment. I want to again balance who Gideon is, both the good and the bad. And here's a lot of good. He hears word of assurance. He's heard it several times. Now he's heard it through the enemy. It finally gets him. And he stops and he worships God. Stop down and think about that for a second. He's in the middle of the enemy territory. There's nothing to say that he left and then worshiped. It says upon hearing it, he bowed in worship. He stops and he worships God right there in the midst of the enemy. Finally, he gets it. He finally recognizes God's been telling him this whole time. Now, some may give him more grief than even I have, and I've given him quite a bit of grief through our lessons. And they would say how long it's taken him to get it, and why did it finally take hearing it from the enemy for Gideon to understand? Why couldn't he have just believed God prior to this? He's had an angel, a prophet, he's dealt with fire and a fleece, and now he's seen a dream and its interpretation from the enemy. And God worked through all of those to relay the message. He gets it and he worships. Real quickly, we can think about this for a moment. When we go through difficult times and we're dealing with challenges, and that might just be a euphemism for some very serious events in our lives, knowing that we face difficult times, can we bring ourselves to recognize that God is with us? And in that moment, when we get that sense of assurance that he's with us, we can stop and worship even in the midst of battle. We can make other application, given as Christians, we are in a growing hostile world against Christianity, and we can worship God even in the midst of the enemy. We know ultimately God's kingdom is going to win out. He's a benevolent king, and he's called us to win as many people to the Lord as possible along the way. We do recognize culturally we face some very, very big challenges, and we can worship God even in that. And I hope that you will think about that. As I said, we've been seeing the development of Gideon's faith along the way, and he's gone from seeing God to obeying God. He's tested God, and now he's worshiping God. Some have said, well, it's the first time he's worshiped God. It's the last time it's going to say anything about his worshiping God. That does play in a little bit to what I want to think about in the next couple of lessons with regard to this idea of the Midianite telling his friend that it was this dream was the sword of Gideon, and that God has handed the Midianite camp into his hand. It's going to be both God and Gideon. And that's the way Gideon takes it, because when he now gives instructions for battle, what does he do? You're going to cry out for the Lord and for Gideon. Well, this defining moment for Gideon, he worships God, he gets up from worshiping God, and then he goes back to the camp. A couple things we move on before, a couple things to say before we move on. We know this, that assurance of victory, or let me rephrase that. Victory is assured. Gideon has assurance of victory. What the Midianite men have said right there in relaying the dream to one another is, the Midianites know that victory for Gideon is assured as well. We don't know how far spread and how quickly this word spread after the dream, but we know it had to have happened within that night, because all of this is taking place in the same night. After Gideon has reduced the army to 300, it said that night Gideon was to go down into the camp, and they are going to now go back in the evening, later in the evening, to basically, we'll say it this way, fight the Midianites. So we have two things involved here. We have a word of assurance of victory that Gideon has, but we also have in the Midianite camp recognition of assurance of their defeat. And that may play a major part in the way they respond to what's about to happen. So keep that in mind. Both sides have got an assurance of what is going to take place. We will just read it and see how it plays out. Interestingly enough, along the way, while we know what the Midianite attitude is, at least among the representative two that we saw, there's nothing said about the attitude or emotional mindset of the 300 that are with Gideon. They are following along. That may say something about their character, but certainly we know that the author doesn't tell us how they feel. They have been following the instructions and will follow the instructions as given by Gideon. So he returns to the camp, and notice what he says when he gets back. He says, "Get up, for the Lord has handed the Midianite camp over to you." Interestingly enough, that's the word that God gave to Gideon in verse 9. He tells him to get up and go. Now Gideon is telling the Israelites to do that. And the second part, of course, is the Lord has handed Midianite camp over to you. That's what God had already told him. And that's what now the Midianites have said. Notice then, it is the Lord. This is another aspect of God's sovereignty. This is taking place at the direction of God. And God has made the promise. He's given the assurances, and now they're going to see the manifestation of that promise in fulfillment. So Gideon then starts to enact a little strategy. We're not given any information about how he came up with the strategy. Maybe God gave that to him in Revelation. Maybe he's been thinking about this for a while. He's going, what am I going to do with 300 people? How's this going to work? Well, what does he do? What does he do? He takes the 300 plus himself, and he divides them up into groups of 100. And then, as we read, they're each equipped, and I'm using that word in quotation marks, they are each equipped with 3 items. Basically a ram's horn trumpet, a pitcher, and then a torch that was inside the pitcher. And that's it. Then he gives them instructions, and I like what's said here. He says, watch me, do what I do, and then when we get there, do as I do. Now, this is not a lesson on leadership, but certainly there is a word about leadership here that I think can be valuable, and that is the leader should be willing to do exactly what he is instructing others to do. And in fact, it's very difficult for him to expect others to do it if he doesn't do it. Along the way, also, what Gideon is doing is modeling, because they've never done this before. This is not going to be the kind of battle that they've ever engaged in before. So he is leading out, and now he's going to show them. So the way this is going to be playing out is a surprise to them, even as it's going to be a major surprise to the Midianites. But notice then what he does. He says, watch me, do what I do, and then when we get down to the camp and we're all around there, you'll do as I do. And then the last thing he says, when they get down there, you're going to blow your horn, and when you blow your horn, you're going to cry out for the Lord and for Gideon. And I've already touched on that issue already, so I won't belabor that here. I won't keep harping on that, but I do think it's going to be important to keep that in mind. Again, note that there's been no instruction given. All they know when they get down there is they're going to blow their horn. But that's why it's important for Gideon to tell them, you do as I do. So they're going to follow down. They're going to go down there and they're going to follow his example. So we see Gideon give the instructions, and I think it's important to recognize that he does say something like, for the Lord and for Gideon. Do this for the Lord and for Gideon. Now, that's standard type war formula language anyway, but given the fact that God has said that this is going to take place as a result of his working on their behalf, it is interesting for Gideon to include himself in there. So standard language, just kind of an oddity at this point. Now, all the instructions are given. And then in verses 19 to 22, we're going to see it all play out. We're going to see the beginning stages. So verses 19 to 22, Gideon leads the initial stage of battle. Let's read that, and we'll talk about it before we conclude. Verse 19, Gideon and the 100 men who were with him went to the outpost of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch after the sentries had been stationed. They blew their ram's horns and broke the pitchers that were in their hands. The 3 companies blew their ram's horns and shattered their pitchers. They held their torches in their left hands and their ram's horns to blow in their right hands. And they shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." Each Israelite took his position around the camp, and the entire Midianite army began to run, and they cried out as they fled. When Gideon's men blew their 300 ram's horns, the Lord caused the men in the whole army to turn on each other with their swords. They fled to Acacia House, which is Beth Shittah, in the direction of Zerera, as far as the border of Abel Mecheloah, near Tabath. Now, lots of place names there. I'm going to do my best to give you some instruction or indication of what that is. But just bear in mind what just took place. We'll talk about that in a moment. So they're given instruction, and now they're carrying it out. So basically what they're going to do is they're going to surround the camp. Now, I don't know if they had 100 here, 100 there, and 100 there, or if they spread out so that people could see what's going on. You get the indication that they're in separate sections around the camp. One author has suggested that the way they did it was there were 100 to the south, 100 to the west, and 100 to the north, and that Mount Moreh was on the east side of the camp. I think that's a possibility. When we looked at the Valley of Jezreel and Mount Moreh last time, we indicated that there's this big valley between Mount Gilboa and, of course, the Gideon Springs. North to Mount Moreh, there would have been that valley. Being 135,000, clearly they would have taken up a huge section of that. I'm not going to nitpick about the nature of where they sat in location relationship to Moreh, but it's very clear they had 3 different sections around the camps. What do? Well, they blew their ram's horns, then they crashed their pitchers, and then they had their torches. Now, what's going on here? What's likely happening is you would normally have in battle someone who would blow the ram's horn that would basically signal it's time to go into battle. The torches, it was nighttime, would have indicated battle, or would have indicated direction of where they could go, visibility. The pitchers probably made a noise such as to wake everybody up, throw them into a frenzy. But when you have 300 of those around the camp, it probably sounded a lot more than there were there. Also, bear in mind, as we said a moment ago, their hands were full. They had a pitcher in one hand, and then they had a ram's horn in the other. Now, the point of the torch being inside the pitcher is that it could be smoldering. It could have already been ignited and smoldering, and that when the pitcher is broken, obviously it creates a loud noise, but it also creates oxygen influx, if you will, that would cause the torches to ignite, and now what was dark became light. If you're in the Midianite camp, you hear ram's horns all around you. Well, only 1 or 2 people in a company would have had a ram's horn. The rest of them would have been soldiers. Not everyone could have held torches. You had to have someone to fight. So what they're probably thinking is that what they're hearing is only a fraction of what is actually out there attacking them. So what they do is they come out of their tents and they are totally confused. They see lights, they're hearing crashing sounds, they're hearing the trumpets blow. And what happens is, in their confusion, people are just waking up. People have been up and now are just trying to go to sleep, and now they're just tired, they're confused. One author has suggested, again, the fact that there's an army mixed of Midianites and Amalekites and other peoples of the east. How well did they recognize each other? And it's dark. They're just killing everybody. They're defending themselves against anybody running around. That's the beginning. Of course, it's not going to end there. What's going to happen then is there are going to be those that start to flee. All the while, Gideon and his men are blowing horns and holding torches and nothing else. God is causing the people of Midian and the Amalekites and the peoples of the east to turn on each other. Definitely God's sovereignty at this point, and that he is watching them defeat themselves. Maybe some of them are coming to their senses and they're realizing we can't stay here, and they start to leave. So what we start to see is that they take off. So what God has done is not literally multiplied the army of Gideon, but multiplied the impact of the army of Gideon. It's important to recognize in all of this that it was the Lord who caused this. One more sidelight, though, as we go through this. We know that it's God handing them over into the Israelite army, or into the Israelites' hand. But for some reason, when they cry out, they add a little phrase, not just for the Lord and for Gideon, but a sword for the Lord and for Gideon. And it harkens back to what that Midianite soldier said when he said that barley loaf was actually a sword. Well, they flee, and we start to see that take place. And as we read, they went in the direction of Zerera as far as Abel Mehaloah near Tabath. I want to show you a couple things, though, that I think will be helpful. I always think it's going to be helpful to have some kind of visual aid here so that we can see where we're going in all of this. Let me show you a couple of maps. Here's it's not really a 3D, it's an aerial view of what we looked at last week. And as you look, you can see the Spring of Harad. This is Mount Moreh, where they were stationed. And then all of this area, as you look, is where they would have been, in this area in between. What happens then is, as they kind of come to their senses and start to move, they start moving eastward and southeastward. And when they do, they go past where the Israelites were originally camped. And I'll show you a little bit more. There's actually a couple of these places known in modern times. So they were here in the valley, and now they've head this way. Here is Beit Hashita, and that's Bet Shita. Okay, the Christian Standard Bible calls it the Acacia House, and that's fine. But they also put a footnote in the text saying, or Beit Shita. Well, what happens is that tells us the direction they start to move. As they do that, however, then they keep going, and there are a couple of other places mentioned. So I'm moving away, obviously, from an aerial view to a map. And you see Beit Shita there again. Beit Shan, that's an important place for Saul later. But as they move, they go down to the southeast, and then they start heading south, away from the mountainous area into the Jordan Valley, and they end up in Abel Mahaloah. That's where they're heading. A couple of other places are mentioned. You have the Zerera, the place known as Zerera, and then you also have the place of Tabath mentioned. Those places aren't really well known. There's speculation, but we know whatever speculation it is involved somewhere even further south than that. Because when we look at next week's story, we're going to see further movements of the people, and we're going to start hearing the names of some of the Midianite leaders as the Israelites pursue these Midianites that are fleeing. Well, I do want to talk a little bit about the area of Abel Mehaloah, because you think, well, that's what's important about that place. Well, there are a couple of things known. Let me mention a couple of them. Among Solomon's 12 governors, is one Baana, who is put in charge of several districts, including the area of Bet Shan, which we just saw in the map north of this, and then Abel Mehaloah, or Mehola. Excuse me. I thought I was in Hawaii there for a second. Mehola or Mechala. We also know that there was Adriel, the Meholathite, son-in-law of King Saul, probably named after the city. But not that I was leading up to this for this reason, but what probably put this place on the map is that Elisha, the prophet, is from this region. He was from this town as well. We don't know the exact location. We're close there. So the dot you saw on the map is really close, but they're still looking. There are a number of tells in that region that have not been excavated yet. And yet it's very possible that one of those is that. But it would have been along that area in the Jordan Valley on the west side of the Jordan. As we read the rest of the text, they end up going further south before they cross over at Sukkoth and then head eastward when the Israelites then go following after them as well. So what's happened so far? God has given Gideon assurance. Gideon has acted on that assurance. God has followed through on his promise. And now, as the battle has begun, it will continue. And we'll see that continue into next week as well. So we've had a couple of moments of application. I think one of the major things, of course, is recognizing God's promises being given and fulfilled. In the big picture, we also see God being sovereign. I mean, our lesson is titled regarding God's sovereignty being a means by which then we can have courage. We see Gideon's courage stemming from God's assurances and acting on those assurances. And so we see that taking place here. God has everything under control. I mean, they were being oppressed because God allowed them to be oppressed as well. In fact, God sent the oppressors because of their sin. Now God is leading out and bringing them deliverance. They need to be dependent on God. So we've dealt with a couple of things related to application, if you will. Sometimes that application is knowledge. Sometimes it will be action on our part. And we'll talk about a couple of those in a moment. But I do want to save a lot more application when we get through the big picture of the life of Gideon and his deliverance of the people of Israel. So again, God is fulfilling what he promised because God fulfills his promises. Next, we know that God works in preparing those he has called. And if you want to think about it, God has exercised great patience working with Gideon. From the moment he, as the angel of the Lord, called him mighty warrior, to the point now where Gideon is leading out in battle, God has worked in him over this course of perhaps months to prepare him for what he's going to do. And God will work in preparing the person that he has called. A couple of things I want us to think about for ourselves, though. And I do ask these of myself as well. What does it take for you and me to trust God's word? We said before, we have things that Gideon didn't have. We have the word of God. We have mature Christians. We have a history of God's faithfulness. But what does it take for when God reveals something to us in his word, or he has spoken something to us, or has spoken something to us through someone else? What does it take for us to finally trust what he has said? We see Gideon going through a development of faith here. Secondly, what does it take for us to finally act? Because true trust, true faith will be manifested in action. Remember that Paul said Abraham believed God and was credited to him as righteousness. James goes on to say, yeah, he was proved righteous by his actions. So in that case, he did believe and he demonstrated his faith by acting. Here we see Gideon growing in his faith and acting. And as a result, that may be one of the reasons why he's in the Hebrews chapter 11 Hall of Faith. There was a process, of course, and maybe that's one thing that we can relate to with Gideon, is that we go through a process. Some are instantaneous and some believe upon hearing the message and they trust God. Others need to see more, and God has provided that. God is not going to be shrinking back from anyone who may ask him questions about what his plan is. But I want to leave those thoughts with you for now. Let us close in a word of prayer, and then I'll talk briefly about our lesson for next week. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for this day, and just ask right now that you continue to work in us to bring us to where you want us to be. Thank you that you will start with us where we are, but thank you that you're never content with where we are, because you have a plan for us and you have a desire for where we are to be in a relationship with you. We do confess times that we often are hesitant, that there are times when we resist, and we know that's immaturity on our part. I pray that you will help us to be willing to be conformed to the image of your Son, to offer up sacrifices of praises, to be obedient to your call in our lives. Lord, work by your Spirit to help us to just recognize your goodness and your will and to be obedient to it. Why would we disobey? Why would we resist when we've already responded to your call on our lives for eternal life? You've saved us. Help us now to grow each day in our faith. Forgive our setbacks, Lord. Help us to be turned back in the right direction. We thank you for your word that has been given to teach us, to train us, to rebuke us and correct us. And I just pray, Father, that we would heed your word. Right now, we pray that as we enter into another week, that you will guide and direct us. Help us, Father, to know where you're leading, to trust it, and then to act upon that. You're a good God, and we love you, and we praise you, and we desire to worship you in all that we do, say, and think. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, next week, our lesson is going to be a continuation of that. I'll say it this way. It will be a continuation of that battle. It's not over yet. And we're going to be looking at more leadership from Gideon. I'll get to that in a moment. Just a real quick 20-second commercial about other options for being able to learn more about the life of Gideon and some other life application from the story of Gideon. Again, I mentioned my professor, Dr. Claude Maritini's blog, where he details this, various aspects of the life of Gideon, as well as video clips of his pastor's sermons on the life of Gideon. You can see the links there. Those will be in the descriptions as well. Our lesson next week then is going to be coming out of the last couple of verses of chapter 7, and we'll be looking at the first few verses of chapter 8, leadership lessons of a conqueror. Now, real quick note, I think it's rather ironic that they're going to stop at verse 24 when there's only one more verse in the chapter before getting to chapter 8, verses 1 through 9. But we're going to discuss that verse. I don't think it's anything that we need to leave out. Well, I hope that this has been helpful. I know that we've been going through a lot related to the life of Gideon. Maybe you didn't think that there was that much that we could actually say about one person in this book in 3 chapters. The fact of the matter is we could go much deeper. There are other things that we can look at even in this narrative, but I think this will be helpful for us so far. Hope that you're getting much out of this. I pray that you'll join me again next lesson. But until then, I pray that you will be well and that you will be blessed.